to another live about history, Tibetan history, Asian history, Indian history, all coming together under this chapter by Taiwanese historian, published by British Columbia Press 2006. Chapter is the issue of the China-India roadway, not railway. I wrote railway. Roadway via Tibet. Free Tibet. Okay, it is part 3, the wartime period, 1938 to 1935. So to preface this, I'm going to go on a bit of a rant. You can skip it. I'll put a timestamp. Buddhism is an Asian religion. And Kato Grigtsen Rinpoche has talked about this in his Nyingma history. I recently found it. In his part 1, he's like, Buddhism isn't mature yet in Australia. It's not mature yet in North America. Y'all still have a long way to go. That kind of thing when he's like prefacing his talk on Nyingma history. And I feel the struggle, because I grew up with these stories like, oh my gosh, the times were so hard. My ancestors, they're from Nanjing. Like, oh yes, we were like totally owned by the Japanese, and then I just assume sometimes that other people also have this upbringing, and that is not the case. They do not know what went down, even the basics during World War II, right? So yeah, Japan owned us. Everyone in Asia basically were like, oh dang, they're here. And like a lot of like serendipitous things happened for the China continent kind of shape to remain as it is. Like Taiwan is kind of like an exception to all of the things that went down. But yeah, like the national idea of the time was to maintain the territorial integrity of that chicken-shaped, rooster-shaped map, you know? And even though people were fighting, I think back in the minds of a lot of Han Chinese people, that was the goal. So then when other people approach like Buddhism and then this Tibet issue, they kind of get thrown off by it all. They're like, why does it matter to the Chinese government that Tibet remains within this territorial region? And it's like, well, because a lot of things went down. Okay, so this is the chapter that discusses how close everything was about to collapse. I read an article published in a not mainstream, but like a censored magazine. It's called 东方历史评论第三集, the third volume in Eastern history commentary. And one reviewer said, history is the religion of Chinese people. That is like a huge statement. But yeah, like in the third volume, there's a guy who wrote about this roadway. He actually wrote it in a very triumphant manner. He's like, oh yeah, there were mosquitoes, there were mudslides, there was food shortages, but in the end, the people's will won over nature's calamities, and now we have like a Yunnan to Burma road. And he did not talk about at all of like how Tibet was like part of this, because it's too sensitive. Like he couldn't even, put that in the equation of things. So here we are, a Taiwanese historian publishing in English to get us a better picture of what happened in the 1930s to 40s. In vis-a-vis Japan, Tibet, India, and all the governments in fighting for control and sovereignty in mainland China. If the British seize Tibet, they will surely be able to reach Sichuan by passing through Tachienlu. This is a predictable, as the frost appears when the weather freezes. So today is actually winter solstice, so it's a great time for us to study how hard things were back in the day. Once foreign countries have invaded Tibet, they will obviously also attempt to reach Bashu, Sichuan. That's another name for Sichuan. Then, downstream, they will arrive at Jingmeng, Hubei. and all of the southern provinces will be embraced and rolled up like a mat. These are quotes from the time. Okay, Japanese military expansion in East Asia had been increasingly intense since the autumn of 1940. In September, Japanese forces occupied the northern part of French Indochina, modern-day Tibet, Vietnam, modern-day Vietnam, where Tokyo set up its military bases and established a substantial protectorate of its own. Soon after, in order to blockade unoccupied southwest China both militarily and economically, the important rail line between Hanoi and Kunming was blockaded by the Japanese. This action coincided with the temporary closure of the Burma Road by the British due to strong pressure from the Japanese. These events dealt a damaging blow to the Chinese, whose international supply routes were now cut off entirely, and whose wartime materials previously transported via these routes into Japanese besieged China were now unavailable. Although the British reopened the Burma Road 3 months after its closure, the establishment of Japanese authority in Indochina continued to increase Chinese fears of an attack on this route. In late 1940, Chiang Kai-shek expressed his worries to the British ambassador in Chongqing, Sir A. Clark Kerr, that the Japanese might attack Yunnan province very soon in order to destroy the Burma Road, China's last means of contact with the outside world. Chiang further pointed out that if Tokyo's offensive eventually succeeded, the Chinese armies would be surrounded and there would be an end to Chinese resistance. British Prime Minister Winston Churchill also shared Chiang's pessimistic viewpoint. In an audience with the Chinese ambassador in London, Mr. Churchill expressed his concern that South China might be the next Japanese military objective. The unexpected Japanese attack on Pearl Harbor in December 1941 brought together China, the United States, and Britain as new allies against the Axis powers. Yet, for the Chinese government, the formation of a new alliance could not immediately reverse its deteriorating military situation. Neither could the Chongqing officials, who theoretically no longer fought a lone battle against their enemy, prevent the likely breakdown of their regime by the Japanese military advance. By the end of 1941 through the early 1942, the Japanese forces captured the Philippines and other Pacific islands, attacked Hong Kong, and ultimately forced the British to withdraw from Singapore and Malaya. In the spring of 1942, key cities in central Burma, such as Rangoon, Bhamo, and Myitkyina, also fell into Japanese hands. In contrast to the Japanese victories in East and Southeast Asia, the British had suffered severely in terms of military strength, which had an extremely bad effect on Chinese morale. For some time around the late 1940s, Chiang Kai-shek and his regime were concerned about the possibility of the British abandoning their Burmese and Indian domains. These fears were not without reason, particularly since the United States had declared that all available resources would be used to secure the Philippines, while no similar declaration came from London concerning Burma and India. In the early 1942, the situation in South China was especially precarious. The Sixth Army of the Chinese force, now a part of the Allied forces that were to be sent to the Burma theater, was kept in Kunming until it was known whether the Japanese were about to attack Yunnan or Burma. At one point, people in Chongqing were convinced there could be a domino effect whereby the whole of Burma, the Indian subcontinent, and even Tibet and other Himalayan states would sooner or later fall into Japanese hands. According to Chinese public opinion of the early 1940s, the Japanese were expected to occupy key cities along the Indian coast as a first step toward controlling India. After this, several puppet regimes would be set up to take advantage of the chaotic political situation in the Indian subcontinent. Finally, the Japanese would utilize Buddhism to win over Nepal, Sikkim, Bhutan, and Tibet. The result, the Chinese believed, would be the end of the nationalist dominance in southwest China. News concerning Japanese activities in Kokonor, southern Tibet, and the vicinity of northern India also inflicted considerable anxiety on the KMT officials in terms of regime security. As early as 1936, reports of Japanese movement in Sichuan, Sichuan, and Tibetan areas abounded. Rather than focusing on the British threat, the Chinese mass media now urged for particular attention to be paid to the aggressive Japanese in southwest China. According to one researcher, around 1937, money transferred from Japanese-occupied Tianjin to Urumqi had reached 300 million silver yuan, most of which was alleged to have been spent on underground Japanese movements in West China. By 1939, the Japanese Secret Service headquarters based in Tokyo-controlled Inner Mongolia had infiltrated Ningxia, Qinghai, and northern Xinjiang extensively and was conducting propagandist activities with a view to creating dissatisfaction among the local inhabitants. There had even been rumors circulating since late 1936 that local authorities in Shanxi, Qinghai, Ningxia, Gansu were covertly planning an anti-Japanese political autonomy with the Soviet-backed Xinjiang government. Given that the KMT regime was not initially in a position to resist Japanese penetration, it was not unlikely that the de facto independent authorities in the Chinese Central Asian provinces considered seeking support not from Chiang Kai-shek's uprooted regime, but from the Russians. In order to prevent such a scheme being realized, 4 central government divisions were alleged to have been moved from China proper into Shanxi toward the end of 1936, one of them even going into southern Gansu. Luckily for the KMT, a pro-Soviet bloc in northwest China never appeared. From time to time, however, the fleeing nationalists had to face the possibility of their political legitimacy and regime security being further endangered. One such time was in early 1939 when it was reported that several Tibetan tribal groups of Golok and Taidam in south and northwest Kokonor had agreed to recognize Japanese suzerainty. This news shocked Chiang Kai-shek's frontier planners and security advisors. The nationalist government in Chongqing, still unable to exercise effective authority in this remote region, was very anxious that the Japanese penetration into Chinese Central Asia would cause a domino effect involving other non-Han communities, particularly the de facto independent Tibet. A confidential report of the Military Affairs Commission in late 1942 further confirmed the news that the well-known Japanese Fifth Column was already reaching deep into North India, South Tibet, and the adjacent Himalayan districts, where they vigorously propagated misinformation to the effect that the defeated British were soon going to surrender to the Japanese Empire. Banzai! Overt collaboration after Pearl Harbor between the Japanese and Subhas Chandra Bose, leader of the Indian nationalists, had particularly worried many political observers in Chongqing. With equipment supplied by the Japanese, Bose's INA, Indian National Army, had set up broadcasting stations in Singapore, Burma, where they helped the Japanese to maintain order and to propagate the Tokyo-promoted Pan-Asian identity. The Tokyo authorities, meanwhile, went to great lengths to declare their good faith to the Tibetans, convincing Lhasa that the withdrawing Allied forces, together with their political and cultural influences, would soon enter Tibet. The Japanese also took pains to persuade Lhasa that Japan was the only nation genuinely willing to help the Tibetans achieve their desired self-determination. The Chinese embassy in London even reported to Chongqing that a group of Indian Congress Party members were already collaborating with the Japanese in North India, where they had recruited Tibetan outlaws and bandits and were plotting to seize war materials for use in anti-British campaigns. The precarious military and political situation in East Asia, as well as the likelihood of Japanese encroachment in South Asia, inevitably forced the vulnerable nationalist government to counteract its opponents by attempting to advance its authority in China's southwestern peripheries, the development of new routes to secure the supply line of unoccupied China, particularly after the nightmarish experience of the Burma Road being cut off, was imperative. During the end of 1940, the idea of building a China-India roadway first emerged as a priority in Chongqing, and it was strongly supported by Chiang Kai-shek. After a series of internal discussions held by the KMT officials in February 1941, Chiang formally ordered the construction of a motorway from southwest Sichuan province through Rima in southeast Tibet, Zayul in Chinese, to the Assam border in India. In May, 2 Chinese survey parties were dispatched in preparation for the roadway. Before long, however, the road program had to be suspended temporarily when the Chinese attempted but failed to secure Tibetan support. Footnote: some scholars have suggested the real threat to China's war effort came not only from the Japanese military machine, but also from impending economic collapse. The Japanese economic blockade, China's increasing isolation from the outside world, and vetoes imposed on imports were particularly damaging. All these factors were directly or indirectly related to the issue of China's supply lines. Thank you for listening, and we will continue this China-India roadway drama in our next video. Bye!